Hello, everyone. My name is Joshua Solomon, and this is my final presentation over wedding traditions in Taiwan and America. For my presentation, I would like to compare and contrast the wedding cultures between Taiwan and the United States. In particular, I would like to compare the traditions done before the marriage ceremony, the attires worn during the wedding ceremony, as well as the symbolisms attributed to these regalias, and the celebrations themselves. For my research background, I decided to compare and contrast the wedding traditions between these two countries because I found the ceremonies performed in the Chinese or Taiwanese cultures to be the most curious among the topics we discussed in this course. I also noticed several differences between the wedding cultures in Taiwan as well as the culture in America. The sources I found relate to this presentation because they possess information about the wedding cultures in Taiwan and America. For example, the article on brides.com provided me with specific American wedding traditions, and the articles on international.thenewslens.com and izn.com provided some traditional Taiwanese wedding practices. Also, the Roberto Vincenti website provided the general meanings of the color of a groom's suit during the wedding ceremony. All this information will be discussed later on in the presentation. First of all, for the American wedding culture, there is no normal or correct way to have a wedding in America. Because America is a largely diverse country with a melting pot of cultures, ethnicities, and religions making it up. For American wedding traditions that are included in the general sense, almost every bride in an American wedding has worn a white wedding dress for their wedding ceremony or reception. This color typically signifies innocence and purity. Next, many couples have bridesmaids and groomsmen at their wedding who are instrumental for planning wedding-related events, such as bachelor parties or bachelorette parties. And lastly, at most weddings in America, newlyweds make their debut as a new couple by performing the first dance of the night at their wedding, usually a slow dance. And in the sense of in the topic of dancing, dancing is typically a main focus at American weddings, taking up a quarter to a third to 2/3 of the time. For Taiwanese wedding cultures, there are certain procedures that must be upheld for a couple to become betrothed. For example, a potential groom or his family will go to a matchmaker to help search out a bride. And this matchmaker is sent to the potential bride's or the bride's family's home to deliver gifts along with letters signifying the groom's interest in them. The groom's family will then send 30 or so gifts to the bride's family with a traditional letter. And if the bride's family accepts the groom to be their potential son-in-law, then they will return half of the gifts along with some of their own gifts. And lastly, a procession to the wedding ceremony takes place involving a sedan that the bride sits on and rides in the whole way, along with fireworks. Some similarities that I found include how it is considered the most respectful option for a groom to ask permission from the bride's parents for her hand in marriage before he asks the bride. Second, how both marriage cultures have typical clothings that couples wear for their ceremonies or receptions. Next, how both cultures view a marriage as a coming together of two families via the connection of the two children. And lastly, how the parents of the bride and groom are involved in the marriage ceremonies. Whereas in Taiwan, the parents are involved for most of the marriage ceremony. They're involved much less in American wedding cultures. And some differences that I noticed were how the wedding culture in America has no definite procedures, while the Taiwanese wedding culture does. As formerly mentioned, how the groom has to or is expected to go to a matchmaker who then has to more or less run a background check to search out for a good bride or what will potentially be a good bride for him. And then he has to send the gifts and the letters and so on and so forth. Next, or how the American wedding culture doesn't call for a vast amount of gifts throughout the proposal process. Usually, a man could get married to a woman with only gifting her the engagement ring and then allowing everyone else who attends the wedding ceremony, whenever it should be, to provide the rest of the gifts. Next, how the Taiwanese proposal procedure involves much help from a matchmaker, while in the American wedding culture, a man could get married to a woman on a whim entirely. A man could meet a woman and get married to her the same day, whether it be in person or online. And lastly, how the colors are variable in American weddings, while the main colors in Taiwanese weddings are typically red, signifying luck, happiness, and celebration. In conclusion, I found through my research, in the course as well as on my own time, that both wedding procedures are full of culture. It is shown how both cultures have been built on centuries of practices, giving each their own uniqueness. Practices as in what the colors typically worn symbolize, as well as the actions performed before, during, and after the wedding ceremonies. Also, regardless of their differences, both kinds of marriages signify the coming together of two families. For my two questions, one, would you rather have a Taiwanese style wedding or an American style wedding, and why? And two, regarding the Taiwanese wedding culture, what do you find most interesting about them, and why? Here are the resources that I use to get my information. Thank you all for being here for my final presentation.